Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. The Green Party is undergoing a resurgence in popular support. Increasingly, local councillors are being elected on Green Party tickets. We've got 2 members of the European Parliament to represent the Green Party, 7 members of the Scottish Parliament, 2 members of the London Assembly. The Greens seem poised to make a breakthrough. More and more people who formerly, like me, were part of the Labour Party have now joined the Greens. Is this the beginning of a drift? Is this the beginning of a shift, whereas Labour drifts to the right, the Greens are moving to the left, and increasingly they will become the main radical party of left progressive politics in Britain? With me to discuss this is the principal speaker of the Green Party, Derek Wall. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you.
I wanted to start by asking you whether you feel that this revival in Green Party electoral support, according to the opinion polls, is in your view just a temporary thing, given that green issues are very much in the news, or whether it can actually be sustained. Are we moving to a situation where the Greens are going to eventually replace Labour as the main radical left party in this country?
Well, I certainly hope so, because if you look at the world we're in, we're consuming 85 million barrels of oil a day. We've got massive disparity between rich and poor. And if you look at Gordon Brown, our likely next Prime Minister, he's much more interested in the economy growing than children or the planet. Now, unfortunately, one of the reasons we're doing so well is because people are realising the severity of environmental problems. Another reason why we're doing well is because of Labour's drift to the right and disillusionment. And certainly we've got activists pouring in from the Labour Party and the Lib Dems who are disillusioned with the traditional parties. But I think we've upped the game. We've got nearly 100 councillors. Now that's remarkable because every single one of those has been elected by first past the post. So by that measure, we're one of the most successful Green parties in the world. Now what we need to do is keep pressing forward. Political opportunities have changed. So in Scotland, we've got the Scottish Parliament, and it looks as if we could be in government. Now obviously, we're not going to be married to the
government in Scotland?
Government in Scotland, and we're in a position where there could be SNP coalition government, and we certainly, case by case, where we've got common policies, will work with the SNP. So this is remarkable. This is big
I've
progress.
heard that in Scotland the Greens are expecting to up their representation to maybe 10 or 11 MSPs.
Yeah.
But the position of the Green Party is that they are prepared to work in coalition with which parties?
Well, it's very much in Scotland the SNP, but what the Greens are going to be doing is looking at it issue by issue by issue. Okay, so it's going to be a case of where the SNP, or if other parties wanted to reject Trident, and of course they've got the power to totally reject it, but it's in Faz Lane, we'd support them. If they want to bring in better public transport, we would support them. If they're coming up with policies which are expanding usage of oil, we obviously wouldn't support them. So, it's very important to be pragmatic, to be in a position where you can govern, but at the same time to be very careful about what you agree to.
Yeah.
But it's remarkable we're in that position.
I think it's interesting that although the other main parties are taking on the Green agenda, ostensibly, despite that, support for the Green Party is on the up. But aren't you concerned that there's going to come a point where a lot of voters are going to say, well, Labour, the Dems and the Tories are all talking green, they've got no green agenda, we don't need the Green Party.
Well, I've got better things to do. If other parties were wonderfully green, I wouldn't be in the Green Party, but there's not real evidence of that. Some people, you and I can think back to green politics in the 80s, and Mrs Thatcher said she was a true friend of the earth. That was laughable. You've got the current head of Greenpeace who worked with Labour to bring in green policies for Labour, but they didn't come about. And if you look at Labour, there's lots of rhetoric, but there's very little action. So we know about the congestion charge, that's great, but we know, at the same time we're being priced off the roads, rail fares are rising. You know, they're a government that supports Trident, that supports nuclear power. You look at the Tories, and sometimes I look at the Tories, and I'm astonished, you know, as a socialist in the Green Party, that David Cameron says some of the same things that I say about the quality of life. But if you look at the action, there's very, very little. You know, George Osborne, who's the Shadow Minister, is saying, well, short haul is going to continue. So we don't really see that real change. And people have often said, well, without proportional representation, the Green Party don't have a role. But the very fact that we exist puts these issues on the agenda. Taking votes from the other parties puts pressure on them. And of course, anybody would say the environment is primary, social justice is primary, but we don't see the other parties delivering, sadly.
I mean, that's very interesting you raised the issue of social justice, because that's been a very noticeable new emphasis of Green Party politics, you know, in many ways, taking the ground that what Labour once held around housing, employment, transport, jobs, social provision and so on. Do you think that that is one of the factors that is encouraging this drift of members from Labour to the Greens?
Yeah, absolutely. So quite often you come across members who say we joined the Greens because of your attitude to peace, your attitude to bringing in a citizen income, the fact you're supportive of trade unions, the fact that you're critical of the increasing gap between rich and poor. But if we look at the fundamentals of ecology, you can't solve the problems of this planet without dealing with issues of justice. So we're the only party to say, on a finite planet, you cannot have infinite economic growth. And if we cannot have infinite economic growth, we have to have redistribution and justice.
And what do you feel about in terms of, you know, you mentioned the first past the post electoral system and its you know, inhibition of smaller parties like the Greens. I mean, which seats in particular in the general election is the Green Party targeting?
Well, the Brighton Pavilion result was great to get 22%. I mean, that's a massive
This is the last
vote.
election.
Last election. So you look at Greens in Europe, and they've been in government in places like Germany, France, Sweden, Belgium, on between 5 and 10%. So though PR is what we really need, we've got strong, concentrated pockets of support. So Brighton really stands out. I mean, that's gone from a couple of percent over successive elections to 22, and I think we can break through there. If we look at London, we've now got councillors in Hackney, Southwark, Lambeth, Camden, all of those kind of inner city seats. So places like Hackney, and of course, if you look at Darren Johnson in Deptford, Lewisham, he got 11%. And you know, Greens elected 5 new councillors last year. So I think that, you know, seats like Lewisham, Deptford, Brighton Pavilion, even without PR, we can win. And you look at the massive impact that our 2 Euro MPs have had. Just a couple of Green MPs could really change the agenda.
But I take your point, and it's great to have optimism.
Yeah.
But I'm, you know, looking at the real politics here, and you know, even to get from 22%, which is a good base in Brighton Pavilion, to actually win the seat, it's quite a mountain to climb. And I'm just wondering, even if you get a handful of seats, you know, it still means the Green Party is going to be quite marginal in a new parliament. And I take your point that you know, the 2 MEPs, Caroline Lucas and Jean Lambert, have been incredibly effective and punched well above their weight. You know, but even so, you know, 2, 3, 4 Green MPs, what can they really do?
Oh, you can change the whole agenda. You can put some new radical visionary ideas in. And as once you get 1 MP, people see the hard work they do, people see the policies, people see us more on television, and then you get more and more and more. I wouldn't say it's a mountain, I would say it's a hill. I remember when I joined this party, and it was the Ecology Party, and we get 40 votes in by-elections. I remember something like 41 votes in Glasgow Central. Now we have a member of the Scottish Parliament there. So, you know, in our existence, we've gone from being a tiny party to a major political influence. For example, I go on television, I discuss things like avian bird flu with the NFU, and if you look at the way the culture has changed, people are much more accepting of the green message than maybe arguments for factory farming. So I've got no illusions about the difficulty, but we're moving forward.
What about issues of organisation and presentation? You see, because like all the other main parties have their shadow Home Affairs spokesperson, their shadow transport,
yeah,
the shadow defence,
yeah,
and so on.
yeah.
And the Greens don't have that
Well,
now.
what we have is we have MEPs who are very regularly on the television. If you look at our MPs, they've got a higher profile, I guess, than any MEPs. I think more people have heard of Caroline Lucas than maybe any other MEP. If you look at the GLA members, they're on the news nearly every day doing good stuff and having influence. And what we're doing is we're putting together a portfolio of key speakers. We've got Stuart Jeffries, who does NUS, NHS. We've got people like Shane Collins looking at drugs. We've got a whole series of people who are coming up and saying more and more. But the kind of main job is from, as well as the elected representatives, is from Sian Berry and myself, and we're the principal speakers. And the fact that we have gender equality, that you have a male and a female, actually is really pushing our profile up, that politics is so male dominated.
I mean, in terms of, you know, the 2 or 3 really big issues the Green Party is pushing at the moment, how would you, which ones would you highlight?
Obviously the greenhouse effect, and that ties into the wider issue that we have to use less energy, we have to respect ecology, we have to make ecology dominate policy, not blind economic growth.
But
Issues
can I
of
press you?
Well,
where on the issue of global warming, where do your policies clearly differentiate from the other main 3 parties?
Well, what the other parties...
in practical terms.
In practical terms, it's putting much more into public transport, it's putting much more into cycling, it's bringing in carbon rationing, it's having a big push for renewables, it's having congestion charges where they're appropriate, but it's saying that we cannot have an economy that grows and wastes and we use more and more forever and ever. Now, if you look on paper at some of the policies of other parties, they don't look too bad. But then if you look at how people like Chris Huhne, who's the Liberal Democrat environment spokesman, has spent in expenses on running his car, the way in which the Liberal Democrats have opposed congestion charges in Edinburgh, the practical action is very weak, unfortunately.
Since you raised the question of congestion charges, a lot of people would say that yes, we do need to do something about congestion in the cities and car usage, but that congestion charging is itself a very cost-inefficient way of doing it. For example, in London, most of the money raised by the congestion charge goes into administering the congestion charge and not into beefing up public transport, not into providing a cleaner, safer environment. So a lot of people would say, is really the congestion charge the way to go?
Well, if you make it more expensive for people to drive, at the same time you must make it cheaper, easier, more efficient for people to use public transport. So congestion charging has got to be used sensitively, and we've got to look at the way it's administered and see if we can make it more economic. But the really key thing is to beef up public transport, beef up cycling, increase provisions for walking.
Where are the funds for this going to come?
Well,
so say, for example, in London, I don't want to be London focused, but London is obviously a classic example where the congestion charge has gone up, it's been extended, it's been increased, and public transport fares have shot up as well. Yeah,
because, I think where the public are rightly cynical is they see congestion charges going up. We look at opinion polls and people are aware of environmental problems, but the danger is that it's just seen as a way of raising money rather than dealing with the environment. So you have to make it run more efficiently, you have to take the money from it and put into public transport. And of course, if we look at the whole national picture, we're planning to spend something like 56 billion on Trident, we're spending billions on the war in Iraq, governments waste lots of money in ministers flying around the world to environmental conferences when they should be doing it on the internet. So, we're a left party, but I think we're a prudent party in that sense. So there's lots of ways in which we could
Prudence from the Greens.
We can, it probably betraying myself as somebody who teaches economics. So if you look at how much money is wasted by politicians flying around the world to pontificate about the environment, if you look at ministerial cars, if you look, I don't want to be too populist, at the way that MPs' wages increase. Another thing we should be doing, which would be very good really, is to decentralise, to actually take offices out of London. We've seen some of that with the Met in Bracknell going to Exeter. Take offices, government admin, take them outside of London. That reduces transport pressure, that saves money. So okay, the congestion charge, we need all the money that we can get from that to go into public transport, but there need to be other sources as well.
I think you raised a very good point about the way in which, ostensibly green measures and taxes are being used in ways which don't actually produce green results.
Yeah,
the air passenger duty, for example. There's no evidence that Gordon Brown is actually putting that into renewable energy, for example.
There's no evidence at all. And in fact, the danger is, and this is one of the problems with the Lib Dem policies, is you cut top rates of income tax and you move towards environmental taxes. And if you just move to environmental taxes, those taxes tend to hit the poor more than the rich. So at the same time, what we want to do is remove VAT. Now, that's a big thing. And
remove all VAT?
Yeah, that's our ultimate goal, and that's a big thing, and we work towards it. But if you actually remove other indirect taxes like VAT, replace them with environmental taxes, you get rid of this negative effect on the poor. But it's got to be a lot more than fiscal policy. So what we would say is you need to actually have local provisions. So you have a parent, their local school has been closed, they've got to drive their kids to school. That's a problem. The post office is effectively being privatised, opened up to competition, which is something that all three parties support in principle. So they're cutting costs, closing down post offices. We look at the rise of Tescopoly and other big supermarkets, and they close local stores. So we've got to actually make it easier for people to be green, not just tax people to death. Or they rightly will be cynical.
I think this is one of the big concerns, is that Greens equals personal sacrifice. And I think a lot of people are prepared to make sacrifices, but up to a point. And I think we're seeing a bit of a backlash over the whole road pricing scheme. That's a classic example.
Well, I think if we saw more Greens on the television, real Greens arguing for real green policies, that we would see that things are very different. And we certainly mustn't be Puritans. I think that our next Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, is the dour Puritan, and he wants us all to work harder, commute further, fuel globalisation. And a green alternative is things like work sharing, doing something about second homes and city bonuses, so that people can actually do better on less. So Jamie Oliver doesn't please me in terms of his sort of relationship to certain supermarkets, but the school stuff is great, and in a way green politics is a sort of Jamie Oliverisation of society, that you have wholesome local food and you have wholesome local economies, and it's about quality of life, not quantity of GNP. So I think the sort of green politics where you give things up is certainly not one that I would want to practice.
So it's more like a different way of life, not a lower standard living.
Yeah, it's another way of doing things. I mean, we live in this society where we're obsessed with GNP, work, commuting, economic expansion, and it becomes crazier and crazier, and people run around more and more. And I think a lot of people would like to have an economy which is concerned with people and the planet, where we downsize.
And what would downsizing mean?
Work less, share more, consume in different ways, enjoy what we have. So a lot of it is the politics of food. So you look at the way that we use supermarkets, of course, very convenient. You look at the way that food is packaged, the way it's run by corporations, and we find that we're eating, I think, 90 kilos of sugar a year. And that's not just personal preference. It's like if you put lots of salt and fat and sugar in food, it's got a long shelf life, it's addictive to consumers. So quality of life has got to be the real primary thing. Green has got to be about pleasure, not just giving things up.
I mean, one of the things that attracted me to the Green Party, apart from the strong commitment to democracy, human rights, social justice, and ecological sustainability.
Like you're giving them more lines.
is the whole question of, I suppose, the green mindset is tackling or head on this idea that wealth and affluence make you happy. And on the contrary, all the evidence seems to show that a materialistic consumer society seems to not correlate with happiness and fulfillment at all. Exact opposite. And I suppose that has got to be one of the most attractive elements of the Green Party, but quite difficult to sell, in inverted commas, to a public which is sceptical of politics in general, and B, it is very much locked in to a materialist, consumerist, acquisitive society.
Yeah. I don't think it's that difficult to sell because I don't think people like commuting more and more. I don't think people like working harder and harder. And if you look at the politics of food, the kind of green politics of food, that's absolutely massive. You know, farmers market, scepticism about Tesco's, people cooking more. I mean, I'm quite shocked that, you know, my kids are not taught how to cook in school, and that's beginning to change. So I think if you look at issues around food and health, they provide some very good templates, but it's not going to be about hectoring people. It's got to be about practical policies. You want to have practical policies to encourage food localisation. A big battle going on about food labelling, and simply giving people more information about food would be good. Okay.
Yeah, but there's an example where a lot of people will say, well, the whole food labelling thing, you know, it's been taken up by the Food Commission, it's been taken up by different political parties. Why do we need a specifically Green Party input on these issues?
Well, if you look at the conventional political parties, they're about the economy growing. So what we find is the Liberal Democrats have had conferences sponsored by Tesco's. What you find are those huge corporate lobbies who are constantly fighting. You know, there's a big battle over traffic lights, for example. So this is why you need the green politics. Now, even without a Green Party, people realise that we're eating rubbish, we're working too much, that it's unsustainable to be using 85 million barrels of oil. But we've got to be out there arguing the case. But I think it's an attractive case.
Well, in terms of being an attractive case, I mean, what do you think are the 2 or 3 or 4, you know, most attractive, you know, headline-grabbing sort of Green Party policies that mark you out distinctly from other parties, but also are likely to have a real popular resonance and appeal?
I think no to war is big. I think cheap public transport is big. I think renewable energy and insulation is big. I think actually doing something about city bonuses is big. Housing is absolutely massive because we're becoming...
Rather than just give me like headlines, can you explain a little bit about each of those?
Well, if you look at the war in Iraq and the whole push to war, that's disastrous. And the same time that we've been pushing war, we've had the scandal with BEA allegedly being involved in bribes. I can't comment too much on that. And we have this huge relationship, we've got this huge arms industry, and actually saying, hey, that doesn't work. That's important, as well as withdrawing from Iraq and calling for peace. But then
I mean, people are going to say, well, you know, tens of thousands of jobs, rightly or wrongly, depend on the arms industry. You know, surely the Green Party has to have an answer to those people, to those concerns.
What we have to do is come up with alternative jobs, and that's maybe not so difficult, because in terms of engineering, we could have people building windmills, renewables, so on. In terms of insulation of homes, that creates jobs. That's important. And ultimately, if we have jobs which are destructive, I mean, we could say, well, why not you use all of East Anglia to grow heroin? I mean, that might not be a particularly good idea, and in some ways that's better than the arms industry. So, you know, we are prepared to say things which are quite difficult, but at the same time, if you look at the public, they don't want more war, they don't want more conflict.
And what about public transport?
Well, public transport massively expands, walking, cycling. You know, it's renationalise, if you look at buses, renationalise rail and plan it so it works. And at the same time, it's localised, more local schools, more local post offices, more local economies, so that people don't have to commute further and further.
Do you really think that renationalising is the key? Because that's going to involve a huge public outlay. Isn't it perhaps more important to focus on public accountability and control, whereby the companies operate within very clear public benefit frameworks?
I think if we look at nationalisation, we obviously need to be very careful about how we do it, so that it's not expensive and it's not unjust. And obviously there are many things which it's not appropriate to have centralised government control. But railways only really work if you have coordination. If you don't have coordination, you have overspends, bottlenecks, all sorts of problems.
Yeah. Well, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of public ownership.
Yeah.
But I just want to throw you the googly that maybe when we've got all these other expenditure plans, that's not the best way to spend, you know, £10 billion. Maybe you're right.
Yeah.
It is about public control.
Yeah.
You know, dictate. You know, yes, government dictated targets about fares, about service provision, and so on, in a much tighter way than currently exists.
Well, if you look at the private sector in this area, it's hugely expensive, having the franchises, the way the train operating companies work. So, I mean, if you look at the franchises, what you can simply do is gradually take away franchises, you know, because they run for 7 years, and then you can have companies which are run by the government. And if you look at the actual rails, I mean, they've actually gone from being nationalised to privatised to effectively renationalised. So what the key thing you've got is train operating companies, and they operate on franchises anyway. So it's not necessarily an expensive nationalisation, but I'd certainly agree it's something that we need to think carefully about.
Do you want to throw me out one other issue you want to talk about?
Housing is absolutely the big one. You know, and this seems to show the mismatch between wealth and poverty. So I've got kids. I wonder how they will ever afford a house. If you look particularly at London, the way it's launching up further and further. You know, a university colleague was saying to me yesterday that you have property companies coming into London, you know, buying up whole streets, huge growth of, you know, housing has been commodified. So, you know, we need big tax disincentives for people with second homes. We need to restore council housing. You know, we need to push all of that because the housing market is a bubble which is going up and up and up. And it's a very good example where the commodification of houses, the buying and selling of houses, actually makes it expensive for people to live. So if you actually have cheap public transport, if you have cheap housing, that's a real start on a green economy.
And just in terms of your prognosis for the immediate future for the Green Party, I mean, how do you see things panning out over the next 12 months and year? I mean, obviously, there's a possibility that if Gordon Brown becomes Prime Minister, he may very quickly call a general election, or maybe if not immediately, maybe within a year. So,
I mean, I think Gordon Brown is a great enemy for the Greens. I mean, I think Gordon Brown is so, you know, fixed on the economy. And as you know, if you look at, say, education, it's all about what's good for corporations, the demands of the market. So I think he's somebody really good for us to be up against. The key thing, I don't think he's going to go for an early general election because I don't think he's going to get the opinion poll bounce. But obviously, like all parties, we're preparing for that. But what we do know is in March there are elections for the Northern Ireland Assembly. The party there, which is you know, linked to both us and the Southern Irish Party, are in a very strong position to get Assembly members for the first time. In Scotland, we want to be upping the number of MSPs to 10 or 12 or more and actually having a real influence on government. Welsh Assembly, we've got a conference in Swansea in March to really launch the campaign. We can gain there. There are local council elections in strongholds like Brighton. So we're up and ready for elections and we're going to do well. But green politics is much more than conventional politics. We do direct action, we do cultural politics. You know, we've got a whole range of ways in which we intervene and change society.
Okay, Derek, thank you very much.
Okay,
we'll
pleasure
have
to
you
talk
back at
to
some
you.
point.
Okay.
Perhaps when we've got a few Green MPs.
That would be
That's
great.
all this week from Talking with Tatchell. Next week I'll be speaking with some of the leaders of the West Papuan independence movement who are fighting against Indonesian colonisation of their country. Thank you.